Hey guys, this is RuRoniK95 here. Once again, it is time for my manga review video. Sorry, I haven't thought of doing one before because I was busy with other things as well, because I wanted to do something as well. Today, we're going to be doing a manga review, which is something that I haven't thought of doing one before, which I probably should have done until now. And today's manga review is Inuyasha Volume 10. Once again, I'm covering another Inuyasha manga volume to review for the very first time. Okay, Scroll 1, The Mummy. This story chapter explains about how where Naraku sees this girl, Sango, who is in the woods, particularly of how she notices of the arrival, how she wanted to kill Inuyasha until Naraku arrived, particularly of how has considered the fact, particularly of how he's able to fulfill her mission, about how she would have basically figured out how she wanted to attack Inuyasha. Meanwhile, somewhere else, Inuyasha and Kagome sees the village all function after in the whole aftermath kind of way, when they notice about how they are forging weapons and armor, and those bones of how they've been demonstrated. When Inuyasha, Kagome, Sango, Moroku and Shippo entered this cave, of what they noticed about how they saw those bones and those bodies, how they encountered of what something is up to them, particularly, of what they notice from out of nowhere as well. Because of how, if they would have asked a villager of how what's in the cave as well, especially on the body, about the hole in the chest. So, by this time, of course, Sango is in pain, particularly how she would never die, particularly as how she would have basically of how Naraku has been under mistaken of the impression of how the evil object is in the Shikon jewel. It didn't seem to go well, particularly for what Inuyasha, Shippo, Kagome, and Moroku has noticed about how they went from out of nowhere, particularly of how something's going on. But this wasn't long until the battle conflict begins with Sango's air boomerang, of how she wanted to battle Inuyasha, but she wanted to defeat Inuyasha with a giant boomerang, but Inuyasha uses the Fang of Steel from the Tetsaiga. Particularly. Despite of how this goes, particularly of how it's under the impression of how the battle goes. Scroll 2, Vengeance. When basically of how Sango realized that Inuyasha is basically her enemy, particularly during this whole conflict battle, particularly. And then Moroku uses the wind tunnel to fight off those demon wasps as well, because they're particularly of how it came from nowhere, because I think this came from Naraku, so this means Inuyasha has to fight off against Naraku, particularly, but Sango has to fight off to the battle against Inuyasha, particularly, of how this goes on. What it seems to go is particularly of how Moroku wants to fight off against Naraku as well, when he uses his own particular ways of how. And yes, he did cut off Naraku's hand, particularly in that chapter. It seems that how it goes quite far until until this happening during this whole battle. In between the battle between Naraku and Sango, particularly. Scroll 3, Suspicions. Naraku realized of how he has his demon wasps as his side, particularly if you look at fight, it's off as well. So he uses those poisonous vapors, particularly when he tells Sango that he shall be waiting for her in the castle, particularly. So it didn't seem to be, you learn over the fact, particularly as how this seems to go, is quite really far that often. When Kilala has to fall off the scent, when Inuyasha wants to fight Naraku first, as well, particularly when seems didn't go quite as this expects, as how when Inuyasha wants to realize that her Inuyasha realized of how he was rescuing Sango at first, after she tries to fight Inuyasha with the poison dust, but he knocked off the filter mask. Particularly, it seems to go quite far, but then she stabbed Inuyasha with the sword. Particularly about how he realized that Naraku's been using Sango, like as his puppet as well. Particularly when she's in badly pain, because they thought Shippo thought Sango is dead, but she fainted in the expectations of how this goes. Yeah, because Naraku has struck the sword right into her arm, particularly. As seems to go, when it has gone pretty well as how this goes. When Moroku wants to fight off Naraku and his demon minions, especially if he could use the wind tunnel, but it didn't go quite very to overcome him. Strap art to this battle is how this goes. For example, as well as I expect. Scroll 4, strategies. When Inuyasha has to take Sango, how his recovery, particularly of how if there was, they wanted to fact if they wanted to defeat Naraku, particularly of how when this particularly seems to go, when Moroku wants to fight against Naraku, as how until its arm that resembles of a branch coming from Naraku is overpowered, trying to. When Moroku tried everything if he could do, as how he considered, but it's something got Moroku in the leg, but then Inuyasha destroys it. So how this particularly goes, and on top of this, Moroku's been impaled when he's been knocked out by Naraku as well. When Inuyasha wants to realize that Moroku's gonna die and all, but he survived as well, particularly when he has the revenge battle against Naraku, as particularly of how it has gotten to the point, when Sango realized of how she knew that Kohaku has been dead, including her father as well. So she wanted to defeat Naraku, but it didn't go. But instead was the pain as well of how when Inuyasha wanted to kill Naraku, and yes, he did in the head, but then Naraku prepares for revenge as his head as well. Scroll 5, Gollum. Yeah, they now that Naraku was dead, particularly of how it's for the foreboding of how the recollections of Kikyo's death have causing so much pain. When then realized that Naraku has been recovering, of how the body moved itself, particularly of how he could start the hellish battle as well. And yes, that's how he particularly wants to do, as how this goes. for all this demonic power, until something happened to Inuyasha's chest, particularly on the pain, but then he just defeats it with his Tetsaiga, particularly, of how he could have basically on this goes. By this time, of course, in the temple, Naraku realized of how he knew that it was destroyed, particularly, of how the castles borrowed some sort of forms of how the concealment of how he wants to figure out something he wants to do. So the theme just goes. So Inuyasha wants to know about the exterminating. When Moroku realized of how it's the doubts of how the enchant of how Naraku's evil deeds have been exposed, of how there's particularly of how there was injuries of how. So by this time, of course, Kagome has the bandages for Sango if she could recover, until she realized, because Sango has realized there was the graves, particularly in the area, which is almost in a different parts. Seems to have it goes, particularly of how there's the good fundamentally of how there was these fake econ shards from Naraku, because they were coming, because he was coming after for the devilish revenge as well. Scroll 6, the birth of the jewel. When they came into the cave, of course, particularly, there is these monster-like bodies, where there's hordes of demons, of how they were everywhere. Take a look at that as well. And of course, during the defeats of how this seems to go, particularly of how there's mortals, even which is almost human, particularly of how what this could have taken onto the whole forebodes of how sort of like Kikyo's death, which is more different than the other, but this is more different than that. Even though there were monks and warlords could exterminate demons when they wanted to destroy it as well. Of course, she has been possessing enough spirit to destroy those 10 demons at once, just to overpower them, even if it was. Of how they were mastering a spell to protect those 4 aspects. That's begin to the target for death as well. When they notice something of how it's going on, even those bodies everywhere, those demons have snuck into the man's heart, which he has been possessed, like a demonic evil spirit possession way of how this goes. When it seems to be particularly of how what they found out, particularly how did they win or lose, especially of how the body has been, even this this person named Midoriko's strength of how her body's been devoured by a great demon. Yeah. Of how her soul's been sucked out of her, particularly of how how it happened, particularly into this whole chaos battle, particularly. And yes, this is how Kikyo purified the jewel, which is the creation of Naraku ever since Kikyo's death, which it all has got to the point as well. Scroll 7, the Water God. Meanwhile, from somewhere else, from that outside of the cave, when they realized if there's a castle any hard to confine, particularly, of how there was, they had to give up the castle search, especially if there's Naraku who's going to come to steal this as well, particularly of how even though something happened to Sango's pain, particularly of how this has gotten to that. With its own about the water god, of how there's some sacrifices something happening, particularly of how this goes. And yet, this has particularly how there is, if they could exercise this creature, what they could do, particularly of how this wanted to go by. When they notice something about what's happening to the shrine, which is something offering to the shrine on the lake, which is before sundown, which it all has gotten to the point, particularly until they see a mysterious person, and they noticed it was a kid, particularly, as how this goes. If there was the water god, How could they notice if a kid is the water god when they thought it was an adult, which is not a kid? When they see this boat that resembles a dragon on the lake, which is the water god's ferry boat on here. Yeah, take notice on this one as well. Yeah, because there was a sacrifice transporting on the water, her god on that boat, and if they comes up devouring the sacrifice, of how they could wanted to tell them about this as well, particularly of how what's something happening, of how if the village will, if they don't even hurry, the village will be destroyed in annihilations, of how this goes, of how the headman's child, they thought it was going to be a sacrifice on this old identical arrogance, of how the villagers wanted to expect of how there was substituted a servant on the kids and the steed, as how this one has got to them particularly as well. Scroll 8, the Holy Relic. So when they travel by this as well, they see the water guide's shrine, which how they notice in the middle of the lake, because they have never seen one that before as well. So when they encounter this, of how it wants to fight off those monster these area ones, which is something more than they have never seen anything mysterious like it before or since as well. And by this time, of course, to the whole sacrifice thing as well, including to how this has gotten to, wants to take the kid's body and like a sacrifice as well. Yeah, until Inuyasha has to fight off those in that water god's temple, and then after he kills them all, they turn back into lobsters or fish, especially those formed carps and river crabs, especially, of how they thought it was a man-eating water god, especially of how this kid knows it was Suikichi, particularly they thought he was the real man. This person knows it's the real headman's child. When he wanted to tell him to let Suikichi go, particularly during the whole conflict with the water god, particularly of how the true revelation as to show himself, as how to identify of who this is and how this goes, particularly of the whole conflict truth, particularly. Scroll 9, the God's Truth. Meanwhile, how this particularly goes, if he is the whole battle of how until Inuyasha and Kagome were vanished into the bottom of the lake. Yeah, that's how it happens, particularly. How this happened. So with that, where did they go next, particularly? When Inuyasha wants to figure out of how he could... and now Kagome's being pulled up from out of the water, except Inuyasha, because he wants to devour... noticed that water god demon wants to devour the child, particularly, until the child's friend has to fight off. So Kagome has to use the arrow to shoot, but it didn't work out as expected, particularly if something couldn't be wrong. And they wanted to escape from that water god's temple, particularly. If she could know if Inuyasha come at this point. When Moroku and Sango came from the water, technically Moroku has rescued Sango from the water, wanted to realize as well, but then because Sango realized that Moroku was kind of being a pervert when she slapped Moroku in the face, particularly. Yeah, because she knew that Moroku can be a pervert at this point. But they wanted to know, they're at the water god's shrine when they noticed. If they found out Inuyasha's in the water, of how this happened, particularly. less, particularly of how the water spirit who's living in the lake is like the two of them, particularly of how this goes. Yeah, what Moroku has to figure out, particularly. Then Inuyasha just survived when Inuyasha has to rescue Kagome at first, particularly. Scroll 10, the True God. When Inuyasha wants to rescue Kagome at first, when Kagome has the chance to fight to protect the children, particularly from the Water God, and he is not coming, particularly, until he's right behind and she has to shoot him with the arrow when they had to escape but then something caught her, like almost tried to be speared by the weapon until Inuyasha arrived to save Kagome, has to stop the battle as well. And on top of this, Inuyasha wants to tell this fraud person to show his true self as a revelation until he escapes into the water. When Inuyasha has to fight off him as well, until, yes, because he calls him a fraud mortal as well, in the water particularly as well. Yeah, because that's how this carnage goes, particularly, of how he calls another scaly little water spirit, or water sprite, or whatever you want to pronounce it. Yeah, he's the water god as well. And Inuyasha wants to fight off, particularly, of how he could have used the Tetsaiga to overpower him as well. This goes. Meanwhile, from far away, Moroku and Sango could know of how they could know if it's anything, and he heard from Inuyasha, Kagome, and the others of how they realized until they found a spell scroll of the confinement. This has much to this. And there was a young woman's voice who was the water goddess, the real one to this captivity, until she appears. Because they know it's the true water goddess, of how they could know, just to defeat the fake water god, who is in the battle with Inuyasha as well. So that's the story, how this happened in Volume 10 of Inuyasha thus far. I mean, the story is very great. I mean, this is how it goes, of how this particularly, of how you would expect, of how there's some more stories on here. And we all know that Sango is introduced, just like in the previous volume, though. Now she's part of with the others, with Inuyasha, Kagome, Moroku, and Shippo has. Ever since, particularly when Inuyasha has wanted to do is defeat Naraku, and he has to fight off this fake water goddess thing in the water, which is particularly at the water god's shrine, particularly, which I think that's located where it's in the water, particularly, of how this goes, of how I realized of how that's the thing. The characters are basically newer. Some of them can be part of the most antagonist character. No, most of them can be well, the villains, however, can be the antagonist. Well, technically, Sango is the protagonist character, who is part of the first characters, other than the other characters that are secondary, particularly. For overall, Inuyasha Volume 10, particularly, is considered to be my favorite volume out of all the Inuyasha volumes. Well, even though I have been rereading the Inuyasha manga, I highly recommend this for your perfect manga recommendations overall, because this, particularly how it's got the good plot of how this manga goes, particularly. And my score for this manga, especially the story on there, a 10 out of 10. That's a good sign of how I wanted to overcome by on talking about a manga like this as well. Yeah, because I know this, and also the art on here was very unique, very good, because it's part of the work from mangaka artist Rumiko Takahashi. Even though I considered Rumiko Takahashi to become one of my favorite mangaka artists on here, Yeah, because what can I say? Rumiko Takahashi is my favorite manga artist as well, particularly. So that's going to be it for my manga review on Inuyasha Volume 10 for today's manga review. For today, you guys, thank you for watching, but before we go, here's what I'm going to say for this manga. Ever since I already looked back on reviewing 9 volumes of the Inuyasha manga on my previous manga review, this is the first time I wanted to cover more mangas to review, especially by reviewing Inuyasha Volume 10. Wow, it looks like I'm reviewing 10 volumes of the Inuyasha manga. If I want to get more volumes of the Inuyasha manga, I will be reviewing more of them as soon as I can. Once I get more of them, particularly as a manga reader, particularly because I love reviewing manga as well. Because, hey, I have been a manga reader since I've been reading a lot of manga, particularly, as well. And thus far, though, that as a manga reader myself, because I wanted to review a manga particularly, once you read the manga and then you review it, that's why. Hope subscribe for content, my Anime Planet link in the description down below. You share this video on your Twitter, Facebook, if you have Twitter, Facebook account, and all of social media. Smack the like button if you enjoy this video. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below on this video if you like as well. If you want to check out my Anime Planet, the link will be in the description down below because I have a huge backlog of manga and anime on my Anime Planet account as well. And also, be sure to smack the like button if you enjoy this video. And also, be sure to click on the subscribe button. Be sure to subscribe to my channel, RuRoniK95. Feel free to join my channel, especially if you're new to my channel as a newcomer. Smack the notifications bell button. Be sure to get notified also as well for more latest updates on here as well. And keep it otaku for this manga review on Inuyasha Volume 10 for today's manga review. It looks like I reviewed 10 volumes of the Inuyasha manga now. This is RuRoniK95 saying thank you for watching my video. I'm glad you liked it. Hope you enjoy it. Hope to see you soon for the next video. Hope you have a great day. This is RuRoniK95 signing off, and thank you for watching my video, and I will see you soon for more videos. Take care. Bye.